All right, so are you ready to dive into this 2024 election?
Absolutely. I think it's going to be a wild one.
Yeah, I think so too. We've got this episode of Today's America, Perspectives on Politics, to unpack.
It looks like someone really wants to understand Kamala Harris and Donald Trump.
Yeah, they want to know what makes them tick, what their strengths are.
And not just like what they're promising on the campaign trail, but like what would their presidencies actually look like?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's kind of like trying to predict two different futures for America, right?
It is high stakes.
Yeah, for sure. Well, luckily for us, this podcast we've got does a pretty good job of breaking down both sides.
Yeah, Alex and Riley, the hosts, do a good job of highlighting each candidate's, strengths.
Okay, so let's start with Kamala Harris. What does the source say about her?
Well, it's interesting. They start by talking about her background. She's been a prosecutor,
Oh, right.
a senator, an advocate for social justice and criminal justice reform. So, she's got this long history of public service.
Yeah, she's not new to the game.
Exactly. And Riley, one of the hosts, actually pointed out that background as a prosecutor might be why she's such a sharp debater.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, makes sense, right?
Yeah.
All those years in the courtroom probably come in handy during those debates.
I could do that.
They also mention how her work on healthcare, climate change, and criminal justice reform, those are all huge issues this election.
Yeah, those are definitely the hot topics that people are talking about, so she's hitting all the right notes there.
Right. So she's got the experience, and she's focusing on what voters care about.
Okay, so what else is the source saying about her strengths?
Well, they brought up how she's been really vocal about immigration and reproductive rights.
Oh.
Issues like that make her a powerful symbol, especially for minority communities who see her as representing representation and progressive reform.
Okay, so she's really tapping into this idea of change and making things better for those who've been marginalized.
Exactly. And remember, Alex, the other host,
Yeah.
he pointed out how Harris talks a lot about unity and inclusion, especially when it comes to things like healthcare and education. She wants to level the playing field.
So it sounds like she's all about lifting everyone up, not just focusing on one particular group.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay, so can you give me some specifics?
Mm.
Like, what would those changes actually look like?
Sure. The source mentioned a few things. For example, she wants to make healthcare more comprehensive, more accessible,
Yeah.
not just tweaking the system we have now, but like a major overhaul.
Wow, so some big changes there.
And she's also pushing for better educational and economic opportunities, particularly for communities that have been left behind.
That sounds like it would impact a lot of people, for sure.
Yeah, potentially millions of Americans.
But that's just domestic issues, right? What about her foreign policy?
So here's where her approach gets really interesting. The source used the word multilateral, which basically means she's all about working with other countries.
Okay, so more cooperation.
Exactly. So think tackling climate change or, dealing with cybersecurity threats as a team, not going it alone.
Okay, so that's a big shift from the America First mentality we've been hearing about lately.
Right. It is. And she's particularly passionate about climate change. She wants to invest heavily in clean energy, not just for America, but to position the U.S. as a leader in the global fight against climate change.
So the U.S. working with other countries, not against them.
Yeah.
It's a different picture for sure.
Very different. All right, so we've got Harris, the experienced reformer, who's all about collaboration and change. Now let's flip the coin and talk about Donald Trump.
Okay, let's do it. What makes him tick?
Well, even the source describes his approach to politics as, shall we say, bold and unconventional.
Yeah, I think most people would agree with that assessment,
Mm-hmm.
but there's no denying that he has a very loyal base.
Oh, absolutely.
What does the source say about his strengths?
Alex from the podcast makes a really interesting point. He says that Trump appeals to the economic and conservative base. They see him as this super successful businessman who can bring back jobs and make America economically powerful again.
Yeah, that's a message that clearly resonated with a lot of voters in the past.
Yeah.
What kind of policies does that translate into?
So the source points to his track record. Tax cuts, deregulation, and policies that are all about boosting domestic industries.
Right. It's all about putting America first, as
Yeah.
he famously puts it.
Exactly. And they specifically mention how he's all about protecting American jobs, particularly in manufacturing and energy sectors. Those jobs that some people feel were lost because of globalization.
Okay, so less about global cooperation, more about focusing on American interests.
Precisely.
Huh.
So how would that play out on the world stage? Would it be a complete isolationist approach?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering.
Not necessarily. The source points out that his foreign policy leans heavily on unilateral decisions, so think renegotiating trade deals to benefit the U.S., even if it means ruffling some feathers with other countries. It's definitely a more assertive, some might even say aggressive approach compared to Harris's collaborative style.
Okay, so on one hand, you've got Harris, the reformer, who wants to work with other countries to solve problems.
Right.
And on the other, you've got Trump, who's much more about putting America's needs first, even if it means going it alone.
Yeah, it's a pretty stark contrast.
Absolutely. And the source even touches on how their personalities play into this.
Oh, yeah.
They note that Trump's straightforward, sometimes combative style is a big part of his appeal to his supporters.
Right.
They see it as strength and honesty,
Hmm.
a refusal to sugarcoat things.
Right. So two very different approaches, two very different personalities.
This is where it gets really interesting. Now that we've unpacked their individual strengths, let's take it a step further. What could America actually look like under each of these candidates?
Let's dive into those possible futures. It's decision time.
Okay,
I'm ready.
let's go.
Okay, so we've got these two potential presidents with totally different styles, right?
Yeah, night and day, exactly. And they've got different priorities too. So let's play what if for a second
Yeah.
and imagine what America might actually look like if either of them wins.
Okay, yeah. Let's start with Kamala Harris.
Okay.
So the source kind of taints this picture of a Harris administration that's laser focused on healthcare.
Makes sense.
Yeah. They're talking about expanding coverage, maybe even borrowing some ideas from countries with universal healthcare.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Given what we've learned about her commitment to social justice and, addressing inequalities, I'm guessing that wouldn't be the only big change on her agenda, though.
Oh, you're right. Healthcare is just the beginning.
Okay.
They also highlight her commitment to tackling climate change.
Uh-huh.
She wants to make major investments in renewable energy sources, like wind and solar, which could lead to a boom in those industries. Tons of new jobs.
Wow. So we're talking about potentially reshaping the entire energy landscape.
Yeah, it's huge.
Yeah.
But it makes you wonder about,
What about those who might lose out in that shift away from fossil fuels? Exactly. That's a great question. And the source does acknowledge that there could be challenges, for industries like oil and gas. It wouldn't be a seamless transition, for sure.
right, there'll be winners and losers.
Right.
Okay, let's talk about foreign policy. We know she's all about collaboration. How would that play out in the real world?
Well, the source suggests that she'd probably start by trying to mend some fences with America's traditional allies. Remember how we talked about multilateralism?
Yeah.
She'd likely rejoin agreements like the Paris Climate Accord and reaffirm those commitments to organizations like NATO.
Okay, so basically hitting the reset button on some of those relationships that have been strained in recent years.
Exactly. The source paints a picture of America under Harris as more engaged in global partnerships. Tackling shared challenges like climate change and pandemics through diplomacy and cooperation, not just military might.
Okay, so it's definitely a different vision for America's role in the world.
For sure.
Okay, but let's not forget about the domestic front. What about those social programs we talked about earlier? Would we see major changes there?
Oh, absolutely. The source predicts a likely increase in spending on social programs aimed at, reducing inequality. Think expanded access to healthcare, education, and job training, particularly for those who have historically been disadvantaged.
Okay, that sounds like it could be a game changer for a lot of people,
Yeah.
but it also makes me wonder, how would all of this be funded?
That's the million-dollar question. And the source hints that it might come with higher taxes, but not for everyone.
Okay.
They specifically mention corporations and high-income individuals as those who might be asked to contribute more.
Oh, so that's bound to be controversial.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Some people would argue that it's about social responsibility, creating a more equitable society. Others might say it discourages investment and hurts economic growth. It's a tough balancing act.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. It's a classic debate that goes to the heart of American politics, right? The role of government in providing for its citizens versus individual responsibility and economic freedom. Okay, so we've explored a potential Harris presidency. Now let's switch gears and imagine a world where Trump gets a second term. What would that look like?
All right, let's dive in. So the source suggests we'd likely see a continuation of his economic policies from his first term, but maybe even more so. They specifically mention a potential revival of those big tax cuts from 2017
All right.
and even more deregulation, especially in industries like energy.
So more of what we saw before, but amplified.
Yeah, exactly. And they point out that a second Trump term could be a boon for sectors like oil, coal, and gas.
Okay.
He's a big proponent of energy independence and wants to see those domestic industries thrive.
Makes sense given his America First stance, but wouldn't that have negative implications for the environment?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
In efforts to combat climate change, that's a valid concern.
Yeah.
And the source also highlights the potential for increased trade tensions, especially with countries like China. Remember how we talked about his unilateral approach to foreign policy? Well, that could lead to some pretty unpredictable consequences for the global economy.
So more confrontation and less cooperation on the international stage.
Got it.
What about domestic policies? Would we see major changes there?
So the source suggests that there might be cuts to social programs.
Okay.
And this is where it gets a bit tricky because they don't provide many specifics. But it seems like those cuts might be a way to offset the costs of tax cuts and deregulation.
Okay, so a potential trade-off between stimulating the economy and providing a safety net for those in need.
Yeah, exactly. And that raises concerns about those who rely on those social programs for, essential needs, like healthcare, food, and housing.
Yeah.
It's a question of priorities and who benefits the most from certain policies.
So we're looking at two very different paths for America.
Totally.
Harris, the reformer, who emphasizes collaboration, social justice, climate action,
Right.
or Trump, who prioritizes economic nationalism and a more assertive approach on the world stage.
It's like choosing between two different visions of what America should be and its role in the world.
It really is. And it makes me wonder, how would all of this play out in terms of specific issues, like the economy, social programs, global relations, the environment? It's a lot to consider.
It is a lot. Let's unpack those potential impacts in part 3. It's time to get into the nitty-gritty and see how these choices could actually affect your life.
Okay, I'm ready. Let's do it. Okay, so we've talked about their strengths, we've imagined what their presidencies might look like, and now it's like the rubber meets the road, right?
Yeah, exactly.
How could all of this actually affect, like, you and me?
Well, the source really emphasizes, these ripple effects of the policies.
Okay.
So let's start with the economy.
Okay, so under Harris, we're talking about potential changes to healthcare, education, climate policy. The source seems to suggest that these changes could lead to a more equitable economy, but maybe at a higher cost for some people.
Yeah, exactly. The source points out that Harris's supporters believe her policies would benefit a lot of Americans in the long run, particularly those who are struggling.
Okay.
Think reduced poverty, better access to health care and education, a real improvement in quality of life for many.
Right. But there are two sides to every coin,
Yeah.
right? What about the potential downsides?
Well, the source does mention concerns from those who think higher taxes and more regulations could actually discourage investment and innovation, ultimately slowing down economic growth. So it's a question of whether those short-term costs are worth the potential long-term benefits.
Yeah, a classic economic debate.
Yeah.
Balancing social good with economic realities. Now, what about Trump? What does the source say about the potential economic impact of his policies?
So the source suggests that his policies could lead to a surge in short-term economic growth, especially for corporations.
Okay.
Think tax cuts and deregulation, fueling profits and boosting certain sectors.
But wouldn't that just widen the gap between the rich and the poor?
That's a major concern that the source highlights. They caution that while some might see immediate benefits, it could come at the expense of the middle class and those who rely on social programs. If those programs face cuts, it could put a real strain on families who are already struggling.
So with Harris, there's the question of whether the benefits of a more equitable economy outweigh the potential costs.
Right.
And with Trump, there's the risk of exacerbating inequality for the sake of short-term growth. It's a lot to unpack.
It is. And speaking of social programs, it's worth noting that the source anticipates major differences there as well. We've already talked about how Harris might expand those programs, aiming to create a stronger safety net.
Right, potentially funded by those higher taxes on corporations and high earners.
Exactly. But what about Trump? The source hinted at potential cuts to social programs. What would that mean for everyday people?
Yeah, I'm curious too.
Well, it's hard to say without specifics, but the source does express concern about the potential impact on those who rely on these programs for essential needs, like healthcare, food security, affordable housing. It raises questions about priorities and who would bear the brunt of those cuts.
It's a sobering thought. Now let's shift gears and talk about something a little more global, foreign policy. We've already touched on the contrasting approaches of Harris and Trump, but what are the real-world implications?
So the source suggests that under Harris, we might see a return to a more traditional American role on the world stage. Think rebuilding alliances, engaging in diplomacy, and taking a leadership role in tackling global challenges like climate change.
So less about going it alone and more about working with other countries to find solutions.
Exactly. And that could have a major impact on global trade security cooperation and efforts to address transnational issues like pandemics and terrorism. It's a vision of America as a collaborative partner, not just a superpower flexing its muscles.
Okay, I see. And what about Trump? Will we see more of that America First approach?
The source seems to think so. They predict a continuation of his unilateral actions, assertive negotiations, and a focus on prioritizing American interests, even if it means ruffling feathers or stepping back from international agreements.
That sounds like a recipe for increased tension and unpredictability on the world stage.
It's certainly a possibility, and the source doesn't shy away from highlighting the potential risks, like escalating trade wars, strained alliances, and a decline in global cooperation on critical issues like climate change.
Wow, so two very different paths for America and its role in the world, with potentially huge consequences for global stability and cooperation. And speaking of climate change, we can't wrap up this deep dive without talking about the environment. What does the source say about the potential impact of each candidate's policies?
Well, with Harris, it seems like we'd see a strong push towards renewable energy and a commitment to tackling climate change head on.
Okay,
Think investments in clean energy technologies, rejoining international agreements like the Paris Climate Accord, and a focus on reducing carbon emissions across various sectors.
sounds like a pretty ambitious agenda. What about Trump? Would we see a continuation of his support for traditional energy sources?
The source suggests that he would likely continue to prioritize energy independence, which could mean continued support for industries like oil, coal, and gas. They also point out his skepticism towards climate change and the potential for a rollback of environmental regulations.
So a potential conflict between economic interests and environmental concerns. It's a tough dilemma with no easy answers.
You've summed it up perfectly. This deep dive has explored the potential impacts of these two candidates on everything from the economy and social programs to global relations and the environment. That's a lot to consider, but hopefully it's given you a better understanding of what's at stake in this election.
It's been an incredible journey through two potential futures for America. And while we've covered a lot of ground, remember this is just the beginning. There's always more to learn and explore.
Absolutely. Stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay engaged. Your voice and your vote matter.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the 2024 election. We'll see you next time.